The office lights had long gone dark when Vivian Caldwell finally stopped pretending she was reading the quarterly report in front of her. She sat alone in her corner office on the 42nd floor of Caldwell Industries, surrounded by glass walls that reflected nothing but emptiness back at her. The Manhattan skyline glittered beyond those windows like 1,000 cold diamonds, beautiful and utterly indifferent to the woman who owned half of it, 34 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's 112-year history. A woman who had clawed her way to the top through sheer will, ruthless efficiency, and an almost supernatural ability to see through weakness in others. The business magazines called her brilliant. The employees called her terrifying. The competitors called her unbeatable. No one called her happy. Vivian closed the report and leaned back in her leather chair, allowing herself a rare moment of honesty. The penthouse apartment waiting for her uptown had 3 bedrooms. She never used a kitchen. She had never cooked in a view that cost more than most people earned in a decade. It also had the kind of silence that could swallow a person whole if they stayed still long enough. She had built an empire, but empires she was beginning to understand made terrible companions. Her phone buzzed with a reminder. The annual company party at the Riverside Grand Hotel would begin in 2 hours. She was expected to attend, to smile, to receive the carefully rehearsed compliments of people who feared her, and to pretend that any of it mattered. Vivian stood up and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Somewhere down there, 42 floors below, ordinary people were living ordinary lives. They were going home to families who loved them, sitting down to dinners they had cooked together, arguing about whose turn it was to do the dishes. She had never wanted that life. At least that was what she had always told herself. But tonight, with the city lights blurring slightly at the edges of her vision, Vivian Caldwell was not entirely sure what she wanted anymore. The Riverside Grand Hotel had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, if fairy tales were written by investment bankers with unlimited expense accounts. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, scattering light across marble floors, polished to a mirror shine. Champagne towers rose at strategic intervals, each glass catching the light like captured starlight. Women in designer gowns floated between clusters of men in tailored suits, their laughter carefully calibrated to sound natural. Vivian arrived precisely on time because arriving late would suggest she cared, and arriving early would suggest she was eager. She wore a black dress that cost more than most people's cars, simple enough to convey authority, elegant enough to demand attention. The room shifted the moment she entered. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes tracked her movement across the floor. Junior executives straightened their postures. Senior managers adjusted their smiles. This was the effect she had cultivated over years of careful work. Fear disguised as respect. Distance dressed up as professionalism. Preston Whitfield intercepted her before she reached the bar. He was 62 years old with silver hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been with Caldwell Industries for 30 years, which meant he remembered a time before Vivian existed, and he had never entirely forgiven her for existing now. Vivian, his voice was warm, but his handshake was territorial. You look stunning as always. Preston, she kept her own voice neutral. I trust the board enjoyed the quarterly results. Indeed, indeed, he gestured toward a cluster of gray-haired men gathered near the terrace doors. In fact, we were just discussing some thoughts about the company's future direction. Perhaps you might join us for a few minutes. It was not a request. Vivian recognized the tactic immediately. Separation from the crowd. Controlled environment. Multiple witnesses who would later remember events however Preston chose to frame them. She followed him anyway because refusing would show weakness, and she had not survived this long by showing weakness. The terrace was quieter than the main ballroom, the sounds of the party muffled by heavy glass doors. 4 board members stood in a loose semicircle, their faces arranged in expressions of collegial concern that fooled no one. Vivian Preston began. We've been reviewing the market analysis, and we believe it might be time to consider a strategic partnership with Hartwell Corporation. When the words landed like carefully placed explosives, Hartwell Corporation was a conglomerate that absorbed companies and stripped them for parts. A merger would mean the end of everything her father had built, everything she had fought to preserve. A partnership, Vivian repeated, keeping her voice steady. Is that what we're calling hostile takeovers now? Nothing hostile about it. Another board member stepped forward. Raymond something. She could never remember his name because she had never found it worth remembering. It's simple mathematics. Their distribution network combined with our manufacturing capacity would create significant value for shareholders. And what about employees? Vivian asked. What about the 30,000 people who depend on this company for their livelihoods? Preston's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. We're not suggesting anything drastic, just some operational efficiencies, redundancy elimination, standard procedure. Standard procedure. Vivian looked at each of them in turn, reading the same careful blankness in every face. You want me to destroy my father's legacy and call it efficiency? Your father was a great man. Preston's voice carried a hint of condescension that made Vivian's fingers tighten around her champagne glass. But the market has changed since his time. Perhaps it's his time for fresh perspectives. Fresh perspectives, she repeated, meaning yours. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Vivian understood what was happening. They were not asking for her input. They were informing her of a decision that had already been made in rooms she had not been invited to. The board will discuss this formally at next month's meeting. Preston concluded. We thought you should have time to consider your position. Her position, not her opinion, not her leadership, her position. Vivian set down her champagne glass with exaggerated care because throwing it at Preston's head would be satisfying but counterproductive. Thank you for the advance notice, she said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. I'll give it all the consideration it deserves. She turned and walked back into the ballroom, her spine straight, her expression controlled, her heart hammering against her ribs with a fury she could not afford to show. The party continued around her, oblivious to the war that had just been declared. Vivian stood near the bar, watching junior executives perform their elaborate courtship rituals, with senior managers watching middle managers laugh too loudly at jokes that were not funny, watching everyone pretend that any of this mattered. She ordered a vodka, then another, then a third. The alcohol did not make her feel better, but it made her feel less. And tonight, less was what she needed. By midnight, the party had thinned to its most committed participants. The executives who had wives waiting at home had already left. The ones who did not have wives or did not want to go home to them lingered near the bar with loosened ties and lowered inhibitions. Vivian stayed because leaving would mean returning to her empty penthouse, and she was not ready to face that silence. Not tonight. Her phone buzzed with messages she did not read. Preston and his allies were probably already strategizing, already planning their next moves in whatever game they thought they were playing. They had been undermining her authority for months, maybe years, building alliances she had been too focused on actual work to notice. She had built this company into something her father would have been proud of. She had sacrificed everything, relationships, friendships, any semblance of a personal life to become the leader Caldwell Industries needed. And it had not been enough. It would never be enough. Because no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many sacrifices she made, there would always be men like Preston Whitfield waiting for her to stumble. Vivian ordered another drink and wondered not for the first time what the point of any of it was. That was when she noticed him. He stood near the back of the room, partially hidden by a marble column, holding a single glass of wine that he had barely touched. He wore a suit that was clearly off the rack, serviceable, but unremarkable, the kind of suit that said he was here because he had to be, not because he wanted to be. She recognized him vaguely from the administrative pool, one of the thousands of faces she passed every day without really seeing. But something about the way he watched the room caught her attention. He was not networking, not performing, not trying to catch anyone's eye. He was simply observing with a kind of quiet patience that seemed entirely out of place at an event designed for anything but patience. Their eyes met for a brief moment. He did not look away quickly the way most employees did when she caught them staring. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and returned his attention to whatever he had been thinking about. Vivian found herself oddly intrigued. Another hour passed. The party dwindled further. Vivian lost count of her drinks somewhere around the fifth or sixth, which should have alarmed her, but did not. She was tired. Tired of fighting battles that never ended. Tired of building walls that no one tried to climb. Tired of being the person everyone feared and no one loved. The man from the administrative pool approached her as she was contemplating whether she could actually stand without the bar's support. Miss Caldwell. His voice was calm, neither obsequious nor afraid. Maybe I should call you a car. She looked at him through the pleasant blur of too much vodka. He was younger than she had thought, early 30s perhaps, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if he had bothered to do anything with it. Brown eyes that held a surprising steadiness. Shoulders that suggested he had carried weight before literal or otherwise. "Do I know you?" Her words came out slightly slurred, which embarrassed her, which made her angry. "Theodore Mercer." He offered a small smile. "I work in the administrative department. Fifth floor." "Fifth floor." She tried to place him and failed. "You're the one who leaves at exactly 5 o'clock every day." He seemed surprised that she knew this. "My daughter gets out of school at 3:30. Her after-school program ends at 5:15. Everyone thinks you are not ambitious." She was not sure why she was telling him this, except that the vodka had loosened something in her that usually stayed tightly coiled. "They're right." He shrugged, unbothered by the accusation. "I'm not ambitious. I just want my daughter to have a better life than I did, that's all." Something about the simplicity of his statement hit her harder than it should have. This man, this nobody, from the fifth floor had something she had never possessed. Clarity, purpose that existed beyond profit margins and market share. "That must be nice," she said, and the bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "Knowing what you want." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen, not as the CEO, not as the untouchable woman everyone feared, but as something smaller, something broken. "Miss Caldwell," he said gently, "I think you've had enough. Let me call you a car." And that was when the tears came. They did not start slowly. They did not build politely from glistening eyes to gentle arms. They erupted from somewhere deep inside her chest, ugly and uncontrolled and utterly mortifying. Vivian Caldwell, who had not cried since her father's funeral 8 years ago, stood at a hotel bar in front of a complete stranger and wept like a child who had lost everything. Theodore Mercer did not panic. He did not call for help or try to quiet her with platitudes. He simply stepped closer, creating a subtle barrier between her and the few remaining partygoers, and waited. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me. I never do this. I never... It's okay." His voice was steady without judgment. "Sometimes the weight just gets too heavy." She wanted to tell him that he did not understand, that she was not some fragile creature who crumbled under pressure, that she had survived things that would have destroyed lesser people, that she was Vivian Caldwell, for God's sake, and she did not fall apart in public. But the words would not come. Only the tears washing away years of carefully constructed armor until she felt raw and exposed and terrifyingly human. "They want to take my company," she heard herself saying. "They've been planning it for months. And I didn't see it coming because I was too busy actually working while they were busy scheming, and now they're going to destroy everything my father built, everything I..." She stopped, horrified by how much she was revealing to this stranger. Theodore Mercer said nothing. He simply let her cry. When the storm finally passed, leaving her empty and exhausted and vaguely nauseous, she looked at him through swollen eyes and waited for the judgment, the contempt, the knowing look that said he had seen the mighty CEO brought low and would remember it forever. Instead, he handed her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. Not tissues, not a napkin. An actual cloth handkerchief, slightly worn at the edges, the kind that belonged to a different era. "My wife used to carry these," he said quietly. "She said tissues were for people who expected to cry. Handkerchiefs were for people who needed to be prepared for anything. Your wife," a shadow passed across his face there, and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "She passed 2 years ago. Brain aneurysm. She was laughing one moment and gone the next." Vivian felt a warmth spread through her chest, unexpected and unfamiliar. This man, this quiet nobody from the fifth floor, had known loss that she could not begin to comprehend. And here he stood, handing her handkerchiefs and offering kindness to a woman who had never once shown him any. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Don't be." He smiled, and this time the sadness was visible at the edges. "She would have liked you. She always appreciated people who fought hard for what they believed in. You don't know anything about me. I know you're still here at midnight drinking alone instead of celebrating with the people who are supposed to be your friends." He paused. "And I know that whatever they said to you on that terrace made you feel like everything you've worked for doesn't matter." She stared at him. "How did you know about the terrace?" "I didn't. Not specifically. He shrugged. But I've worked at Caldwell Industries for 3 years. I've seen how Preston Whitfield operates, and I've seen how you look when you come back from meetings with him. No one had ever noticed how she looked after anything. No one had ever paid that much attention. Why do you care? The question came out sharper than she intended, but Theodore Mercer did not flinch. Because someone should, he said simply, because you're a human being, not just a title, and because my daughter would be very disappointed in me if I walked away from someone who was hurting. The answer was so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything Vivian understood about how the world worked, that she did not know how to respond. Come on, Theodore said, gently taking her arm. I'm going to call you a car. You need to go home and sleep this off. I don't know where I live. The words came out before she could stop them, and she realized with horror that they were true. The vodka had blurred everything, including the address of her own apartment. Theodore looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating options, weighing risks, making decisions. Okay, he finally said. Then I'm going to take you somewhere safe until you remember. Theodore Mercer's car was exactly what Vivian would have expected if she had ever bothered to imagine what kind of car Theodore Mercer would drive. A 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear fender and a child's car seat in the back. The interior smelled faintly of crayons and something sweet, maybe spilled juice from a forgotten sippy cup. Dashboard cracks spread like river deltas across the plastic. He helped her into the passenger seat with the same steady calm he had shown all evening. No fumbling, no awkwardness, just quiet competence that suggested he had taken care of people before. I'm sorry about the car, he said as he started the engine. It's not exactly what you're used to. Vivian wanted to tell him that she did not care about the car, that she had grown up in a house where everything was expensive and nothing was warm, that this vehicle with its crayon smell and juice stains felt more like a home than any of the places she had ever lived. But the words stuck in her throat, so she just shook her head and looked out the window at the passing city lights. They drove for 30 minutes through empty streets. Theodore did not try to make conversation. He simply drove occasionally, glancing over to make sure she was still conscious, giving her the gift of silence that was not awkward or heavy. The neighborhood they entered was nothing like the gleaming towers of Midtown Manhattan. 3-story apartment buildings lined narrow streets. Fire escapes clung to brick facades like metal spiderwebs. Streetlights cast pools of orange light on cracked sidewalks. I'm on the 3rd floor, Theodore said as he parked. The elevator's broken again, so we'll have to walk up. Again. It's been broken more than it's worked in the 2 years I've lived here. He smiled ruefully. Welcome to affordable housing in America. He helped her out of the car and up the stairs, his arms steady around her waist as she navigated steps that seemed to multiply with each flight. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Vivian was sweating, despite the cool air, her designer heels hanging from Theodore's other hand. The apartment door was painted a blue that had once been cheerful and was now mostly tired. Theodore unlocked it quietly, gesturing for her to step inside. The first thing Vivian saw was the drawings. They covered almost every available wall space. Crayon masterpieces on construction paper, taped up with more enthusiasm than precision. A purple elephant standing on what might have been a rainbow. A family of stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. A house with flowers growing taller than its windows. My daughter, Theodore said softly. She's 6. Believes the world needs more color. Vivian walked further into the apartment, her vodka-blurred vision taking in details that would have been invisible in her normal state. The second-hand furniture that did not quite match. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter. The single photo on the end table of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. It was small. It was worn. It was nothing like the spaces Vivian had inhabited her entire adult life. And somehow, impossibly, it felt more like home than anywhere she had ever been. You can take the couch, Theodore said, pulling a blanket from a closet. It's not much, but it's comfortable. My daughter's asleep in her room, so we should probably keep quiet. Where will you sleep? The armchair. He nodded toward a chair that looked like it had survived 3 previous owners. I've slept in worse. Vivian should have argued, should have insisted on calling a car now that the cool night air had cleared her head slightly, should have removed herself from this situation that was so far outside the boundaries of appropriate employer-employee interaction that it could not even see those boundaries from where it stood. Instead, she sat down on the couch and let Theodore drape the blanket over her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth. She was not used to thanking people. She was used to expecting. Theodore settled into the armchair, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence was different here than in her penthouse. Less empty, more full of things unsaid, but somehow understood. "Why did you help me?" Vivian asked finally. "I've never done anything for you. I didn't even know your name." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "When my wife died," he said slowly, "I spent 6 months feeling like I was drowning. I went to work, I took care of my daughter, I did everything I was supposed to do, but inside I was dying." He paused, staring at some point in the middle distance. "And one day a woman at the grocery store, a complete stranger, saw me standing in the cereal aisle with tears running down my face. She didn't say anything. She just stood next to me for 10 minutes while I fell apart. When I finally stopped crying, she handed me her handkerchief and walked away." He looked at Vivian directly. "I never saw her again, never got her name, but she taught me something important. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a person is just be present. No judgment, no expectations, just presence." Vivian felt the tears threatening again and fought them back. "Your wife was lucky," she said, "to be married to someone like you. I was the lucky one." Theodore smiled and the sadness was there again, but softer now. "She taught me that love isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up, every day, even when it's hard." The words settled over Vivian like another blanket warming something deep inside her that had been cold for a very long time. She closed her eyes, intending to rest for just a moment. But the weight of the evening, the vodka, the tears, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, all of it pressed down on her until she could not fight it anymore. She slept. Vivian woke to gray light filtering through thin curtains and the disorienting realization that she had no idea where she was. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The blanket smelled like fabric softener and something vaguely floral. Somewhere nearby, she could hear the soft murmur of a voice she did not recognize. Memory returned in fragments. The party, the terrace, Preston Whitfield's condescending smile, the vodka, the tears, Theodore Mercer. She sat up slowly, her head protesting the movement with a dull throb that promised to become significantly worse. The apartment looked different in daylight, smaller and shabbier, but also somehow more real. The colorful artwork on the walls blazed with an energy that seemed almost aggressive in its cheerfulness. Theodore was not in the armchair. She could hear movement from what she assumed was the kitchen, accompanied by the low hiss of something cooking on a stove. Vivian looked down at herself. Still in her black dress from the night before, now hopelessly wrinkled. Her stockings had a run from ankle to knee. Her hair, which had been professionally styled 12 hours ago, now felt like it had survived a hurricane. She should leave, immediately, before this situation became any more awkward than it already was. But when she tried to stand, her legs had other ideas and she ended up sitting back down with a thump that was loud enough to announce her awakening to anyone listening. "Good morning." Theodore appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a mug of something that smelled like salvation. Coffee. Strong coffee. The kind of coffee that could resurrect the dead. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing her the mug. "I don't have any cream or sugar that isn't the kind with cartoon characters on the box, so I hope you take it black." Vivian wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic and inhaled deeply. "Black is fine. Black is perfect." She took a sip and felt the caffeine begin its slow work of reconstruction. Theodore sat down in the armchair across from her, giving her space that she appreciated more than she could say. He was dressed casually now, jeans and a faded t-shirt that suggested this was what he wore when he was not performing the role of employable employee. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I was hit by a truck, dragged behind it for several miles and then run over again for good measure." He smiled. "That sounds about right. Do you remember much from last night?" Vivian hesitated. She remembered more than she wanted to. The tears, the confession about her company, the mortifying vulnerability that she had displayed to a complete stranger. "I remember enough," she said carefully. "I owe you an apology. What I said, how I behaved, that was completely inappropriate." "You don't owe me anything." Theodore leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "You had a hard night. You needed help. I was there, that's all." It was not all, and they both knew it. But Vivian appreciated his willingness to pretend. She looked around the apartment again, taking in details she had missed in her vodka haze, the stack of bills on the counter, the second-hand furniture, the careful economy of a life lived on the edge of not quite enough. "This is where you live," she said. It was not a question. "This is where we live." Theodore nodded toward a closed door that Vivian assumed led to a bedroom. "My daughter and me. It's not much, but it's home." Home. The word sounded different when he said it, less like a location and more like a feeling. Vivian looked at the photo on the end table, the woman with kind eyes. "Your wife was beautiful." She was. A pause. She was also stubborn and messy, and she could never remember where she put her keys. She laughed too loud at her own jokes. She burned everything she tried to cook. She was completely imperfect, and I loved her more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. He met Vivian's eyes. And then she was gone, and I had to learn how to live without her, how to be a father without a partner, how to build a life that still meant something, even though the most important part of it had disappeared. Vivian did not know what to say. She had never lost anyone the way Theodore had lost his wife. Her father's death had been painful, but he had been old, sick, ready. This was different. This was the kind of loss that arrived without warning and never fully left. "I'm sorry," she said again and again. It felt inadequate. "Don't be." Theodore smiled, and it was real this time, not shadowed by grief. "She gave me 6 years and a daughter who makes the world brighter just by existing. That's more than a lot of people get." Before Vivian could respond, the door to the bedroom opened. A small figure emerged, rubbing eyes with tiny fists, a stuffed rabbit dragging on the floor behind her. She was wearing pajamas covered in dancing unicorns, her hair a tangled mess of brown curls, her face still soft with sleep. "Daddy." She blinked at the unexpected scene. "Why are you awake?" Theodore's entire demeanor shifted. The sadness that had lingered at the edges of his expression vanished, replaced by a warmth that seemed to light him from within. "Hey, sweetheart." He held out his arms and the little girl shuffled into them with the automatic trust of a child who had never been given reason to doubt. "I'm awake because we have a guest." The girl, who Vivian now realized must be his daughter, turned to look at her. Brown eyes exactly like her father's studied Vivian with the solemn intensity that only children can manage. "Are you Daddy's friend?" she asked. The question, in its innocent simplicity, struck Vivian harder than any of Preston Whitfield's carefully calculated attacks. Before she could answer, Theodore spoke. "Emmeline, this is Miss Caldwell. She works with Daddy. She wasn't feeling well last night, and I made sure she got somewhere safe. We need to be nice to her because she's had a hard day." "A hard night," Emmeline corrected seriously. "You said night, Daddy." "You're right, a hard night." Theodore's voice was gentle with affection. "Now, do you think you could say good morning to Miss Caldwell?" Emmeline studied Vivian for another long moment. Then she walked over to the couch with the deliberate steps of someone who had not entirely mastered walking yet and stopped directly in front of her. "Good morning, Miss Caldwell," she said formally. Then in a smaller voice, "You're very pretty." Did you know that Vivian felt something crack inside her chest? Something that had been frozen for a very long time. "Thank you," she managed. "You're very pretty too." Emmeline considered this. "I know," she said without arrogance. "Daddy tells me every day. He says Mommy was pretty too, and I look like her." She tilted her head. "Do you have a mommy?" "Emmy," Theodore said gently. "That might be a personal question." "It's okay." Vivian found herself speaking before she could reconsider. "I had a mommy once, but she went away when I was very young." "That's sad." Emmeline's small face creased with sympathy. "Did you have a daddy?" "I did. He died a few years ago." "That's even sadder." Emmeline reached out and patted Vivian's knee with a small hand. "It's okay. Daddy says when people we love go away, they watch us from the stars. So your mommy and daddy are probably watching you right now, and your daddy is probably very proud of you." The words hit Vivian like a wave, unexpected and overwhelming. This child, this tiny person with unicorn pajamas and tangled hair, had just said the thing Vivian had been desperate to hear for 8 years. "Your daddy is probably very proud of you." She had built an empire. She had sacrificed everything. She had fought and clawed and bled for a company that bore her family's name, and not once in all that time Had anyone told her that her father might be proud? The tears came again, softer this time, less violent. Vivian did not try to hide them. Emmeline watched with concern. Did I make you sad? No, sweetheart. Vivian wiped her eyes with the handkerchief she realized she was still holding, the one Theodore had given her the night before. You made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time. What? Vivian looked at this child, at her father watching from the armchair, at the evidence of a child's imagination covering the walls, and the coffee cooling in her hands, and the morning light warming an apartment that contained more love in its two small rooms than her penthouse had ever held. Hope, she said. You made me feel hope. Emmeline beamed. That's good, she declared. Daddy says hope is very important. He says it's what keeps us going when everything is hard. She looked up at Theodore for confirmation, and he nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. That's right, sweetheart. Hope is very important. Vivian smiled, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the expression felt natural on her face. Your daddy is a very wise man, she said to Emmeline. I know. Emmeline nodded seriously. He's also very good at making pancakes. Are you going to stay for breakfast? The question hung in the air. Vivian knew she should say no, should make her excuses and call a car, and return to her real life, the one with board meetings and hostile takeovers in an empty penthouse waiting. But Emmeline was looking at her with those hopeful brown eyes, and Theodore was not saying anything, just waiting. And the morning light was warm, and somewhere outside the city was waking up without her. Yes, Vivian heard herself say. I think I would like that very much. The kitchen was even smaller than it had appeared from the living room. Theodore navigated its limited space with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make the most of what he had. He moved between refrigerator and stove and counter with an economy of motion that suggested years of repetition, pulling ingredients from their designated spots without needing to look. Vivian sat at a tiny table that could barely accommodate 3 people watching him work, while Emmeline chattered happily about her upcoming art show at school. Miss Peterson says I have a gift for colors, Emmeline informed Vivian seriously. She says some people see the world in normal colors, but I see it in extra colors. That's why my drawings are so beautiful. I believe it, Vivian said, and found that she meant it. The drawings in the living room are extraordinary. Emmeline glowed. Which one is your favorite? Vivian thought about the crayon masterpieces she had glimpsed. The purple elephant, the rainbow, the stick figure family. The family, she said, the one with everyone holding hands. Something shifted in Emmeline's expression. That's Mommy and Daddy and me, she said quietly. I drew it after Mommy went to the stars, so I wouldn't forget what we looked like together. The kitchen fell silent. Theodore had stopped moving his back to them, his hands frozen over the mixing bowl. Vivian felt her heart ache in a way she had not experienced in years. It's beautiful, she said softly. Your mommy would love it. I know. Emmeline's voice was matter-of-fact now, the way children are when they have learned to carry grief as naturally as they carry their own names. Daddy put it in a special frame. It's in his bedroom where he can see it every morning. Theodore turned around and Vivian saw that his eyes were wet. He did not try to hide it. Okay, pancake crew, he said, his voice only slightly unsteady. Who wants to help with the mixing? Emmeline's hand shot up. Me, I'm the best mixer. You are the best mixer, Theodore agreed. Miss Caldwell, would you like to supervise? It was such a small thing, being invited to participate in a Saturday morning ritual. Such an ordinary moment, the kind that happened in millions of kitchens across the country every weekend. But for Vivian, who had never experienced anything like it, it felt like being invited into something sacred. I would be honored, she said. They made pancakes together. Emmeline stirred with more enthusiasm than precision, sending flour flying in directions flour was not meant to fly. Theodore caught the worst of it, with practiced hands turning potential disasters into minor inconveniences. Vivian watched and learned and laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny, but were delivered with such earnestness that laughter seemed the only appropriate response. The pancakes, when they finally emerged from the skillet, were slightly burned on the edges and probably had too much cinnamon. Emmeline insisted that cinnamon was the secret ingredient, and Theodore did not have the heart to tell her that most recipes did not consider half a jar to be an appropriate measurement. They ate at the tiny table crowded together in a way that should have been uncomfortable but instead felt intimate. Emmeline demonstrated her preferred technique for syrup application which involved covering every square millimeter of pancake surface. Theodore pretended to be shocked by her sugar consumption, while secretly adding more syrup to his own plate. Vivian ate and watched and felt something unfamiliar taking a root in her chest. This was what she had been missing. This simple, messy, imperfect warmth. This sense of belonging to something larger than herself. This evidence that life could be measured in moments rather than achievements. When Emmeline finally declared that she was full patting her small stomach with satisfaction, Vivian realized that the morning had disappeared without her noticing. Sunlight now flooded the apartment, chasing away the last of the gray dawn light. "I should go," she said, and the words felt wrong even as she spoke them. "You don't have to," Emmeline said quickly. "You could stay and watch cartoons with me. Daddy makes really good hot chocolate, even though he always puts in too many marshmallows." "There's no such thing as too many marshmallows," Theodore protested. "There is when they overflow the cup." Vivian smiled at their bickering, but she could feel reality pressing in at the edge of this perfect morning. She had a company to save, battles to fight, a life to return to, even if that life suddenly seemed smaller and colder than it had the day before. "I really should go," she said again, "but thank you for everything." Theodore walked her to the door, leaving Emmeline to her cartoons. In the hallway, away from his daughter's ears, the dynamic between them shifted slightly. They were no longer just two people sharing a breakfast. They were an employer, an employee, a CEO, and a file clerk. Two humans who had crossed lines that probably should not have been crossed. "About last night," Vivian began. "We don't have to talk about it," Theodore said. "Nothing happened that needs explaining." "I told you things." Vivian heard the vulnerability in her own voice and hated it. "About my company, about the board, about... You told me things when you were hurting and drunk and needed someone to listen." Theodore's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not going to use them against you. I'm not going to tell anyone. As far as I'm concerned, last night was just one human being helping another." Vivian looked at him, at this man who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by being kind to her. Who had opened his home to a stranger, made her pancakes, let his daughter call her pretty. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do any of this for someone like me?" Theodore considered the question seriously. "Because my daughter asked me once what kind of person I wanted to be. And I told her I wanted to be the kind of person who helped people even when it was hard, even when they didn't ask, even when they might not understand." He paused. "She holds me to that. Every day." Vivian felt the tears threatening again and blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough in front of this man. "Your wife was right," she said. "You are one of the good ones." Theodore smiled. "I try. Some days I succeed more than others." They stood in silence for a moment, neither quite ready to end whatever this was that had grown between them overnight. "I should go," Vivian said for the third time. "I know." Theodore nodded. "Will you be okay?" It was such a simple question, asked with such genuine concern that Vivian almost broke down again. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think I might be better than I was yesterday." "That's a start." She turned to leave, then stopped at the top of the stairs. Something was nagging at her, some unfinished business that she could not quite identify. Then she remembered. "Last night," she said, turning back, "when I asked about your bed." Theodore's face flushed crimson, and for the first time he looked genuinely flustered. "That was... You were drunk. You didn't mean..." "What did you say?" Vivian pressed. "I remember asking, but I don't remember your answer." Theodore was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I said, only if you're the one beside me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to examine. Vivian felt her heart do something complicated and unexpected. "Did you mean it?" Theodore met her eyes. "I meant it in that moment. What it means now, I don't know. This is all very complicated." "Yes," Vivian nodded slowly. "It is." She should tell him to forget it, should draw the line clearly and firmly, and return to the world where she was untouchable and he was invisible. Should pretend that this morning had never happened. Instead, she smiled. "I think I'd like to find out." And she walked down the stairs before either of them could say anything else, leaving Theodore standing in his doorway with the morning sun streaming through the window behind him and a future neither of them could have predicted stretching out ahead. Monday morning arrived with the weight of unfinished conversations and the strange sensation of being a different person than she had been on Friday. Vivian Caldwell stood at the window of her corner office watching the city wake up 42 floors below. The same view she had seen 1,000 times before. The same glass and steel and endless ambition stretching toward a horizon that never got any closer. But something had shifted. Something fundamental. She kept thinking about pancakes with too much cinnamon. About a little girl who believed her father was the wisest man in the world and a father who worked so hard to deserve that belief. About a question asked at 2 in the morning and an answer that still echoed in her chest. Only if you're the one beside me. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Miss Caldwell, your 9 o'clock is here. Vivian turned from the window. Send them in. But instead of the department head she was expecting, she found herself reaching for her phone and dialing a number she had memorized without meaning to. Theodore Mercer, please report to the executive floor. The man who walked into her office 20 minutes later looked different than he had in his own apartment. The casual clothes were gone, replaced by the same unremarkable suit she had seen at the party. His posture was straighter, more guarded. The easy warmth that had filled his kitchen was nowhere to be found. This was the employee, not the man who made pancakes. Vivian understood. In this building, they were not two people who had shared breakfast with a 6-year-old. They were a CEO and an administrative worker separated by 40 floors and 1,000 unwritten rules about how power was supposed to work. Close the door, she said. Theodore obeyed, his face carefully neutral. Am I in trouble? He asked. Vivian almost smiled. Almost. Why would you think that because people from the 5th floor don't get summoned to the executive level unless something has gone very wrong? He paused. Or very right. And in my experience, very right doesn't happen to people like me. Vivian gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit down, please. He sat, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the wariness in his eyes. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, the way people always waited when they were in the presence of power they didn't control. She hated that she had made him feel that way, hated that her position, the very thing she had worked so hard to achieve, had become a barrier between them. I want to talk to you about a project, she said. Theodore blinked. A project? The board is pushing me to merge with Hartwell Corporation. They want to gut this company and sell it for parts. Vivian leaned forward. I'm not going to let that happen. But to stop them, I need to prove that there's another way. A better way. She pulled a folder from her desk and slid it across to him. Employee welfare, flexible hours, on-site childcare, mental health resources, fair promotion practices based on merit, not FaceTime. Theodore opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something that looked almost like hope. This is, he looked up at her. This is everything we've needed, everything the employees have been asking for. I know. Vivian met his eyes. And I need your help to make it happen. My help. Theodore shook his head. I'm nobody. I push paper on the 5th floor. What could I possibly contribute to something like this? Vivian stood and walked around the desk, stopping close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the one she had noticed when he was making coffee in his tiny kitchen. You're not nobody, she said quietly. You're someone who leaves at exactly 5 o'clock every day because your daughter matters more than your career. You're someone who lives in a 3-room apartment and still manages to fill it with more love than I've ever seen in a penthouse. You're someone who helped a stranger when it would have been easier to walk away. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. The board thinks employee welfare is a weakness. They think caring about workers is something that gets in the way of profit. I need someone who can show them they're wrong. Someone who lives the reality I'm trying to address. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. You want me to help you build something that could save my job and thousands of others? Yes. And you're asking me because of what happened Saturday night. It wasn't a question, but Vivian answered anyway. I'm asking you because Saturday night showed me that I've been building the wrong things. I've been so focused on protecting this company from external threats that I forgot to protect the people inside it. She sat down in the chair beside him, abandoning the power position behind her desk. Help me fix that, please. Theodore looked at the folder in his hands, at the carefully prepared documents, that represented months of work she had done in secret. Then he looked at her and she saw the moment when the employee disappeared and the man from the kitchen returned. "Okay," he said, "I'm in." They started working together that same week. At first, they kept things professional, meetings in conference rooms, emails with proper formatting, the careful distance that workplace hierarchies demanded. But the project was too big, too important, too personal to be contained by office hours and sterile meeting spaces. By the second week, Theodore was bringing work home with him. By the third week, Vivian was showing up at his apartment after Emmeline went to bed, her laptop balanced on her knees, as they argued about implementation timelines and budget allocations. The apartment felt different at night, quieter, more intimate. Emmeline's artwork seemed to watch them work, silent witnesses to something that was becoming harder to define with each passing day. "You're wrong about the childcare costs," Vivian said one evening, pointing at a spreadsheet on her screen. "We can get better rates if we partner with an existing provider instead of building our own facility." "And you're wrong about the implementation timeline," Theodore countered. "You can't roll out flexible hours in 3 months. Managers need training. Systems need updating. People need time to adjust." They argued constantly about details, about priorities, about the best way to phrase a proposal that would convince a board full of people who had already decided to hate whatever Vivian suggested. But the arguments were different than any Vivian had experienced before. Theodore didn't back down when she pushed. He didn't agree just to avoid conflict. He challenged her assumptions and defended his positions and treated her like an equal instead of an authority figure. She found it infuriating and exhilarating, and something else she was afraid to name. Late one evening, while reviewing financial documents for the welfare project, Vivian noticed something odd. A series of transactions from 6 months ago routed through subsidiaries she didn't recognize. The amounts were small, easily overlooked, but the pattern was familiar. She had seen similar patterns before in companies that were being hollowed out from within. She made a mental note to investigate further. Preston Whitfield had been with the company for 30 years. He knew where all the bodies were buried. Perhaps it was time to find out if he had buried a few of his own. One night, 3 weeks into their collaboration, Vivian arrived at the apartment to find Emmeline still awake. "Miss Caldwell." The little girl launched herself at Vivian with the full-body enthusiasm that only children can manage. "You came back. Daddy said you might not come back tonight because you had important meetings, but I knew you would come. I told him." Vivian caught her surprised by how natural it felt to hold this small, warm weight. "You were right. I came back." "I'm always right," Emmeline nodded seriously. "Daddy says that's one of my best qualities." "I said you're confident," Theodore corrected from the kitchen doorway. "There's a difference." Emmeline ignored him. "Miss Caldwell, do you know how to make French toast?" Vivian looked at Theodore, who shrugged helplessly. "She's been asking all week." "I don't think I've ever made French toast," Vivian admitted. Emmeline's eyes went wide with horror. "Never, not even once. My family wasn't really the breakfast cooking type." "That's so sad." Emmeline took Vivian's hand with the casual possessiveness of a child who had decided that someone belonged to her. "Don't worry, I'll teach you. I'm very good at teaching." And that was how Vivian Caldwell, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, found herself standing in a tiny kitchen, learning to make French toast from a 6-year-old. The recipe, according to Emmeline, had 3 essential elements. First, the bread had to be thick. Thin bread gets too soggy and that's gross. Second, the egg mixture needed vanilla. Just a little bit or it tastes weird. Third, and most importantly, there had to be cinnamon. Lots of cinnamon. Cinnamon is the secret ingredient that makes everything better. Vivian followed instructions, carefully dipping bread in beaten eggs, while Emmeline supervised with the intensity of a Michelin inspector. Theodore stood at the stove, handling the actual cooking part, since neither his daughter nor his guests could be trusted with open flames. "You're doing it wrong," Emmeline announced when Vivian let the bread sit in the egg mixture for too long. "It's going to be all mushy now." "Sorry." Vivian laughed, actually laughed, and the sound surprised her. "I'm not very good at this." "That's okay." Emmeline patted her arm consolingly. "You're good at other things. Daddy says you're very good at running the company. He says you work harder than anyone he knows." Vivian looked at Theodore, who had suddenly become very interested in the skillet. He says lots of things about you." Emmeline's voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp with 6-year-old observation. He says you're smart and brave and you care about people even though you pretend you don't. Emmy, Theodore said, his voice carrying a warning. What, it's true, you said it. A warmth spread through Vivian's chest. Your daddy is very kind. I know. Emmeline returned to supervising the bread dipping. He's the best daddy in the whole world, but he's sad sometimes when he thinks I'm not looking. I think you make him less sad. The kitchen fell silent except for the sizzle of bread in the pan. Vivian didn't know what to say. She was used to boardrooms and negotiations and the careful language of corporate warfare. She was not used to children who saw everything and said it out loud without apology. I hope so, she finally managed. I hope I make both of you less sad. Emmeline considered this. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned her attention to the critically important task of ensuring proper cinnamon distribution. The French toast, when it was finally done, was slightly burned and definitely had too much cinnamon. But sitting at that tiny table watching Emmeline demonstrate her preferred technique for syrup application, Vivian thought it was the best thing she had ever eaten. After Emmeline went to bed protesting that she wasn't tired, even as her eyes drooped with exhaustion, Vivian and Theodore sat in the living room with their laptops and their spreadsheets and the comfortable silence that had grown between them. She's amazing, Vivian said quietly. Your daughter, she's absolutely amazing. She's a terror, Theodore smiled. But yes, she's also amazing. You've done a good job raising her alone. Theodore was quiet for a moment. I had a good partner for the first 4 years. Sarah did most of the hard work. I'm just trying to live up to her example. Vivian set down her laptop, giving him her full attention. Tell me about her, if you want to. Sarah, Theodore leaned back, his eyes going somewhere far away. She was a kindergarten teacher. Spent her days with 5-year-olds and loved every minute of it. She had this way of making everyone around her feel special, feel seen, like they mattered. He paused and Vivian could see him choosing which memories to share. She was messy, chaotically, gloriously messy. Our apartment always looked like a tornado had passed through, and she would just laugh and say that clean houses were for people who had given up on living. She burned everything she tried to cook. Literally everything. I took over kitchen duties after she set a pot of soup on fire. How do you set soup on fire? I still don't know, Theodore laughed, but there was sadness at the edges. She was gone before I could ask. Vivian reached out, not quite touching him. I'm sorry for your loss. It was 2 years ago. Theodore's voice was steady, practiced at carrying this weight. Brain aneurysm. She was laughing at something Emmy had said, some ridiculous joke about butterflies, and then she just stopped. I called 911. The ambulance came, but she was already gone before they arrived. The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief that time had softened but never erased. I didn't know how to survive it, Theodore continued. For months, I just went through the motions. Work, Emmy, sleep, repeat. I felt like I was drowning in slow motion and nobody could see it. But you survived. I had to. Theodore looked toward Emmeline's bedroom door. She needed me, and Sarah would have haunted me if I gave up. She would have found a way back from wherever she went just to tell me I was being an idiot. Vivian smiled, imagining it. She sounds extraordinary. She was. Theodore met her eyes. And she would have liked you. She always appreciated people who fought hard for what they believed in. You said that before, that first night. I meant it then. I mean it now. They looked at each other across the small space of the living room, across the larger space of everything that separated them. Can I tell you something? Vivian heard herself ask. Anything. She took a breath. You lost your wife, the person you loved most in the world, and I can see how much that hurt you, how much it still hurts. But Theodore, I've never had anyone to lose. Theodore waited, letting her find the words. I built walls around myself so high that no one could ever hurt me. I became untouchable because I thought that was the only way to survive. And I was right in a way. No one has ever hurt me the way you were hurt. No one has ever left me the way Sarah left you. She paused, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest like a stone. But no one has ever loved me either. Not really, not the way you loved her. I've spent 34 years protecting myself from pain, and all I've done is protect myself and from everything worth feeling. Theodore moved closer on the couch, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. You know what I think, he said softly. What? I think you've spent your whole life building an empire because you were afraid of being small, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of letting anyone see the person behind the title. He reached out and took her hand, gently giving her every opportunity to pull away. But that person, the one behind the title, she's extraordinary. She makes my daughter laugh. She works until midnight trying to make life better for people she's never met. She sat in my kitchen and learned to make French toast even though she could probably buy the restaurant. Vivian felt tears prickling at her eyes. You make me sound better than I am. I make you sound like exactly who you are. Theodore's thumb traced circles on her palm. The only difference is that now I'm saying it out loud. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Vivian knew she should stop this, should pull away site workplace policies, remind them both of the thousand reasons why this was a terrible idea. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft, at first tentative, two people who had both been hurt in different ways, testing whether they could trust again. Then it deepened, carrying the weight of lonely nights and unspoken hopes and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of something new. When they finally broke apart, Vivian was breathing hard, her heart racing in ways that had nothing to do with business strategies or board meetings. That was, Theodore started. Inappropriate, Vivian finished. Ill-advised, potentially catastrophic for both our careers. I was going to say nice, Theodore smiled, but those work too. Vivian laughed, the sound breaking whatever tension remained. We should probably talk about what this means. Probably. Theodore didn't move away. But maybe not tonight. Tonight, can we just eat? Beto. Vivian looked at him, at this man who had lost everything and still found reasons to hope, who raised a daughter alone and never complained, who had shown her more kindness in a few weeks than she had received in years. Yes, she said, tonight we can just be. They stayed on the couch, not kissing again, just sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. Eventually, Vivian fell asleep there, her head on Theodore's shoulder, more at peace than she had been in longer than she could remember. When she woke at dawn, covered with the same blanket from that first night, Theodore was making coffee in the kitchen, and Emmeline was already awake, announcing that Miss Caldwell had to stay for breakfast because they had leftover French toast ingredients. Vivian stayed. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Vivian's life. She didn't know how to measure happiness. It wasn't something she had much experience with, but she knew that she looked forward to arriving at Theodore's apartment in ways she had never looked forward to anything. She knew that Emmeline's drawings had started including a third figure, a tall woman with dark hair standing next to the daddy and the little girl. She knew that she smiled more, laughed more, it felt more alive than she had in years. But happiness, as Vivian should have known, always comes with a price. The office gossip started quietly at first. Whispers in break rooms, knowing glances exchanged across cubicles, the kind of rumors that spread through corporate environments like wildfire through dry brush. The CEO was spending time with an administrative worker from the 5th floor. They had been seen leaving the building together. Someone had spotted them at a coffee shop near his apartment, laughing over documents. Someone else had noticed how often she called him to the executive floor for meetings that never appeared on any official calendar. Vivian tried to ignore it. She had dealt with gossip before, had learned long ago that people would talk no matter what you did. Better to focus on the work on the project that was slowly taking shape, on the presentation that would hopefully convince the board that there was an alternative to destruction. But the gossip kept growing, feeding on itself, becoming something darker with each retelling. Preston Whitfield noticed. Of course he did. He had been looking for ammunition against her since the moment she took the CEO position, and now finally she had given him exactly what he needed. She didn't know about the photographs until it was too late. Pictures of her leaving Theodore's building at odd hours. Pictures of them talking too closely outside the office. Pictures that, taken out of context, told a story that was both true and completely misleading. Meanwhile, Vivian continued her quiet investigation into the suspicious transactions she had discovered. The trail led through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts, each layer peeling back to reveal another. But the pattern was becoming clearer. Someone was siphoning money from Caldwell Industries, small amounts that wouldn't trigger audits, but consistent enough to add up to millions over time. And every trail seemed to lead back to the same source accounts created during Preston Whitfield's tenure as CFO before he moved to the board. She wasn't ready to act on what she had found. Not yet. She needed more evidence, more documentation, more proof that would hold up against the inevitable counterattacks. But she filed it away, waiting for the moment when she might need it. That moment came sooner than she expected. The company's annual family day was held on a bright Saturday in early autumn with games and food trucks and a bounce house that Emmeline declared the best thing ever invented. Theodore had been nervous about attending. It was one thing to work with the CEO on a secret project. It was another to appear at a company event where everyone would be watching, judging, forming opinions. But Emmeline had wanted to go, and Theodore could never say no to his daughter when she looked at him with those hopeful eyes. They arrived separately, maintained appropriate distance, pretended that they were nothing more than colleagues who happened to know each other slightly better than the average coworker. For a while it worked. Emmeline ran between attractions with the boundless energy of childhood. Theodore chatted with other employees, accepted compliments on his daughter, behaved like the unremarkable administrative worker he was supposed to be. Vivian watched from a distance, close enough to see them, far enough to maintain deniability. She should have been watching more carefully. The comment came from a woman in marketing whose name Vivian had never bothered to learn. She was standing near the face painting booth with a colleague, not quite whispering, not quite speaking normally. "That's him, right? The one who's been sleeping with the CEO. Must be nice, right? Daddy gets promoted, kid gets to come to the fancy party. Wonder what he had to do to earn those perks." They laughed ugly and knowing, and neither of them noticed the small girl standing just behind them, frozen in place with a half-eaten corn dog in her hand. Emmeline didn't understand the words. She was 6 years old, innocent in the way that only children could be. But she understood the tone. She understood that these women were saying something mean about her daddy. She understood that they were laughing at him. She started to cry. Vivian saw it happen from 30 feet away, saw the woman's words, saw Emmeline's face crumple, saw Theodore rushing toward his daughter with panic in his eyes. Something snapped inside her. She crossed the distance in seconds, her heels striking the ground with each step, her face transforming into the mask of ice that had made grown executives tremble. "What did you say?" The two women turned, their laughter dying as they recognized who was addressing them. "Miss Caldwell, we were just—" "I know exactly what you were doing." Vivian's voice was quiet, but it carried a fury that seemed to lower the temperature around them. "You were spreading malicious rumors in front of a 6-year-old child. You were mocking her father within her hearing. You were being cruel for no reason other than your own entertainment." The women's faces went pale. "We didn't know she was listening. That makes it worse, not better." Vivian stepped closer. "Anyone who speaks that way about another employee, especially in front of their child, is not someone I want representing this company." She looked at them with the cold calculation she usually reserved for hostile takeovers. "You have two options. You can submit your resignations by Monday morning, or I can have HR begin termination proceedings for creating a hostile work environment. Your choice." They left without another word, practically running toward the parking lot. Vivian turned to find Theodore kneeling beside Emmeline, wiping tears from her face while murmuring reassurances. The little girl was hiccuping, her body still shaking with the aftermath of crying. "Miss Caldwell." Emmeline's voice was small, confused. "Why were those ladies saying bad things about Daddy?" Vivian knelt down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "Sometimes adults say unkind things because they're unhappy with their own lives," she said gently. "It's not about your daddy. He's a wonderful father and a wonderful person. Those women were wrong, and they won't be saying anything unkind again. You made them go away." "I did." Emmeline considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old processing new information. "You're like a superhero, but with high heels instead of a cape." Vivian smiled despite everything. "Something like that." She looked at Theodore over Emmeline's head. His expression held a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that looked almost like fear. This moment, she realized, had changed everything. She had just publicly defended him, had just made their connection undeniable to anyone watching, had just given Preston Whitfield exactly the ammunition he needed. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Ma'am. The board meeting was called for the following Thursday, 3 days after Family Day. Vivian knew what was coming. She had seen the memos circulating, the private conversations stopping when she approached the careful distance that board members suddenly maintained. Preston Whitfield had been busy. The conference room felt different when she entered, the air thick with anticipation and barely concealed hostility. 8 board members sat around the polished table, their faces arranged in expressions of professional concern that fooled no one. Vivian, Preston stood to greet her with a handshake that felt more like a threat. Thank you for joining us on such short notice. Preston, she kept her voice neutral. I assume this is about the merger proposal, so in part, he gestured to her seat, then remained standing himself, a power play she recognized but chose to ignore. We've received some concerning information about your conduct. My conduct? Your relationship with an employee? A subordinate? Preston's smile was sympathetic in a way that made her skin crawl. We understand these things happen, but the optics are problematic. Vivian looked around the table, reading each face. Some showed genuine discomfort. Others showed barely concealed satisfaction. None showed support. My personal life is not the board's concern, she said carefully. It becomes our concern when it affects company operations. Another board member spoke up, one of Preston's allies. When it calls into question your judgment. When it creates potential legal liability. What liability? I haven't violated any policies. Not technically, perhaps. Preston spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. But the appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as impropriety itself. Shareholders are asking questions. Employees are gossiping. The situation has become untenable. Vivian felt the walls closing in. What exactly are you proposing? Preston looked at her with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so clearly satisfaction. We're giving you 72 hours. Either Theodore Mercer is terminated for cause, or we'll call a vote of no confidence in your leadership. The words hit her like physical blows. That's not a choice, she said. That's an ultimatum. It's an opportunity, Preston corrected. An opportunity to demonstrate that you can prioritize the company's interests over your personal attachments. Isn't that what leadership requires? Vivian looked around the table one more time, searching for any ally, any voice of reason. She found only silence. 72 hours, she repeated. 72 hours. Preston nodded. I trust you'll make the right decision. She found Theodore waiting in her office when she returned, his face a mask of controlled anxiety. I heard, he said before she could speak. The whole floor heard. Preston made sure of it. Vivian walked to her window, staring out at the city that suddenly seemed smaller, meaner, more indifferent than ever. He wants me to fire you. If I don't, they'll remove me as CEO. I know. Theodore moved to stand beside her, close enough to touch, but not touching. What are you going to do? Vivian turned to look at him. What do you think I should do? I think you should fire me. The words were quiet but clear. No hesitation, no self-pity. You built this company into something your father would be proud of, Theodore continued. You've worked your entire life for this position, and the project we've been building, the Employee Welfare Initiative, none of it happens without you in that chair. You're telling me to sacrifice you to save my job. I'm telling you to make the logical choice. Theodore's voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. I'm just an administrative worker. The company will survive without me. It might not survive without you. Vivian felt something break inside her, not a fragile crack, but something deeper. Something that had been holding her together for years. You're not just an administrative worker, she said, her voice shaking. You're the man who taught me that power isn't worth having if you don't use it to protect people. You're the man whose daughter draws pictures of me standing next to you both. You're the man who, she stopped, unable to continue. Theodore reached out and took her hands. Vivian, I can't fire you. The words came out raw, desperate. I can't sit in this office making decisions about employee welfare knowing I sacrificed the man who showed me what that actually means. Then don't fire me. Theodore squeezed her hands. But don't destroy yourself either. There has to be another way. Vivian looked at him, at this man who had every reason to be angry, to be frightened, to be selfish, who was instead offering her grace she wasn't sure she deserved. There might be, she said slowly, but it requires sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Vivian took a deep breath. I need to think. I need time to figure this out. Theodore nodded. Then take the time. I'm not going anywhere. He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper that he pressed into her hands. What's this, my resignation letter? His voice was soft but firm. In case you decide that saving the company is worth more than saving whatever we have. Vivian looked at the paper, at the neat handwriting that spelled out everything Theodore was willing to give up for her. Then she looked at him, at the man who had offered her kindness when she deserved none, who had shown her that love didn't have to be something you feared. No, she said. She tore the letter in half, then in quarters, then in pieces so small they fluttered to the floor like strange, sad snow. You don't understand, she said, meeting his eyes. You're the first person who ever made me want to be better. The first person who made me believe I could be more than just powerful. I'm not going to let them use you to turn me back into someone who doesn't care. Theodore stared at the torn pieces of paper, then at her face. What are you going to do? Vivian smiled, and for the first time since the board meeting, she felt something that might have been hope. I'm going to find a way to keep everything. You, Emmeline, the company, all of it. Is that possible? I don't know. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the warmth of him, the reality of him. But I'm going to try, because you taught me that some things are worth fighting for even when the fight seems impossible. Theodore leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment. Sarah used to say something like that, he murmured. She said that love wasn't about finding someone you could live with. It was about finding someone you couldn't live without. Vivian felt the weight of his words settle into her bones. I'm not saying I love you, she said carefully. It's too soon for that. We barely know each other. I know. Theodore opened his eyes. But maybe we could find out, together, if you manage to save the world first. Vivian laughed, surprising them both. Deal, she said. I'll save the world, and then we'll figure out the rest. She kissed him quick and fierce and full of promise. Then she stepped back, already planning, already strategizing, already looking for the path through an impossible situation. She had 72 hours to save everything that mattered. It was time to get to work. The night before the board meeting, Vivian did something she had never done before. She went home. Not to her penthouse with its empty rooms and expensive silence, but to the small apartment on the third floor of a building with a broken elevator where Emmeline's artwork covered the walls and the air smelled like cinnamon and something she was beginning to recognize as love. Theodore opened the door before she could knock, as if he had been waiting for her. Perhaps he had been. She's asleep, he said quietly, stepping aside to let her in. Had a big day at school. Art show practice. Vivian nodded, but she was already moving toward Emmeline's bedroom, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The door was slightly open, casting a thin stripe of hallway light across the small bed where the little girl slept. Emmeline was curled on her side, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, her face peaceful in the way that only sleeping children can manage. Vivian stood in the doorway and watched her breathe. This child who had known loss before she could understand what loss meant, who had learned to carry grief as naturally as she carried her own name, who still believed that the people we love watch us from the stars and that hope was the most important thing in the world. This child who had started drawing pictures of 3 people holding hands instead of 2. Vivian felt something fundamental rearranging itself inside her, settling into a new configuration she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. She had spent 34 years building an empire, had sacrificed everything, relationships, friendships, any semblance of a normal life, in pursuit of power that was supposed to make her untouchable. And now, standing in the doorway of a 6-year-old's bedroom, she finally understood what she had been running from all along. Not failure, not weakness, not the judgment of men like Preston Whitfield. She had been running from this, from the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone so much that losing them would destroy you. Theodore's wife had known that vulnerability, had embraced it, lived it, died in the middle of it. She had been laughing at a butterfly joke one moment and gone the next, leaving behind a husband who still carried her handkerchief and a daughter who drew pictures of stars. That kind of love was dangerous. It could break you in ways that no business failure ever could. But standing here watching Emmeline sleep, Vivian realized something else. That kind of love was also the only thing worth having. She found Theodore in the kitchen, making tea with the quiet efficiency she had come to associate with him. He handed her a mug without asking if she wanted one, and she accepted it without pretending she didn't. They sat at the tiny table where they had shared so many meals, so many arguments, so many moments that had slowly built into something neither of them had expected. "I've been thinking about Sarah," Vivian said. Theodore looked up surprised. "What about her? About what you told me? How she was laughing one moment and gone the next?" Vivian wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "You said you realized that everything you had been chasing, the career, the promotions, none of it mattered compared to Emmeline." "That's right. But you didn't stop living. You didn't give up. You kept working, kept showing up, kept building a life for your daughter." Theodore nodded slowly. "I had to. She needed me." "No," Vivian shook her head. "It was more than that. You could have just survived. Could have done the minimum, gone through the motions, let grief hollow you out until there was nothing left. But you didn't. You made pancakes on Saturday mornings. You learned to do her hair in pigtails. You filled this apartment with drawings and laughter and hope." She looked at him, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. "You chose to live, Theodore. Really live. Even though you knew how much it could hurt. Even though you had already been hurt in the worst possible way." Theodore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Sarah taught me that," he said. "Before she died, I used to think that love was about protecting yourself, about building walls and keeping people at a safe distance. But she showed me that love is the opposite. It's about tearing down the walls, about letting people in even when it's terrifying, about choosing vulnerability over safety." He reached across the table and took Vivian's hand. "The night she died, the last thing she said to me was about Emmeline. She said, 'Don't let her grow up afraid to love. Promise me you'll teach her that love is worth the risk.'" Vivian felt tears burning in her eyes. "And you kept that promise." "I try." Theodore's grip tightened on her hand. "Every day I try." They sat in silence, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "I know what I have to do." Vivian said finally. "The board meeting." "Yes." She took a deep breath. "I'm not going to fire you, and I'm not going to let them remove me." Theodore's eyes widened. "How?" Vivian smiled, and for the first time in days it felt genuine. "I'm going to give them exactly what they want, and take everything they're not expecting." The boardroom felt different when Vivian entered it the next morning. The same glass walls, the same polished table, the same faces arranged in the same careful expressions of professional concern. But something had shifted, some fundamental change in the air that made everything feel charged with possibility. Preston Whitfield stood as she entered, his smile solicitous in a way that made her skin crawl. "Vivian, I trust you have had time to consider our proposal." "I have." She took her seat at the head of the table, claiming the position that was rightfully hers. "And I've come to a decision." The board members leaned forward slightly, anticipation evident in every face. They thought they had won. They thought she was about to sacrifice Theodore to save her position, proving in the process that she could be controlled, manipulated, forced to choose between her principles and her power. They were wrong. "I'm stepping down as CEO," Vivian said. The words landed like bombs in the silent room. Preston's smile faltered, confusion replacing satisfaction. "I'm sorry, what?" "Effective immediately, I will be transitioning from the role of Chief Executive Officer." Vivian let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching the reactions around the table. "However, I will be assuming the position of Chairman of the Board with full voting rights and oversight authority." Preston's face went red. "That's not... You can't just..." "I can." Vivian pulled a folder from her briefcase and slid it across the table. "According to the company bylaws, the CEO position and the chairman position can be held by different individuals. The chairman has no direct authority over employees, which eliminates any conflict of interest concerns regarding my personal relationships." She smiled, and it was the smile that had made competitors surrender and executives weep. "Furthermore, as chairman, I retain the right to nominate my own replacement as CEO subject to board approval. I'm recommending Patricia Hawthorne from our operations division. She shares my vision for the company and has the experience necessary to implement our employee welfare initiative." Preston sputtered. This is outrageous. You're trying to have it both ways." "I'm trying to do what's best for the company." Vivian's voice was calm, measured, utterly controlled, "which is something you seem to have forgotten in your eagerness to remove me." She looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. Let me be clear about what's happening here. Preston Whitfield has spent the last 6 months building alliances and gathering ammunition not to improve Caldwell Industries, but to position himself for a takeover. The merger with Hartwell Corporation was never about shareholder value. It was about giving Preston control of a combined entity where my influence would be diluted. She pulled another document from her folder. I have records of private meetings, email correspondence, and financial arrangements that suggest Preston has been negotiating personal benefits with Hartwell in exchange for pushing through the merger. Benefits that were never disclosed to this board. The color drained from Preston's face. That's a lie, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Vivian slid the document toward him. Perhaps you'd like to explain why Hartwell's CEO has been making deposits into an offshore account that traces back to your wife's maiden name. The same pattern of shell companies and hidden transactions I've been tracking for weeks. The room went silent. The other board members looked at Preston with expressions that ranged from shock to barely concealed satisfaction. Alliances were shifting before her eyes' power reconfiguring itself around the new reality. I move that we accept Vivian's proposal. One of the board members said, a woman who had been silent until now. Transition to chairman nomination of Patricia Hawthorne as CEO and a full investigation into the allegations against Preston Whitfield. Seconded, another voice added. Preston opened his mouth to object, but the vote was already happening, hands rising around the table in a wave that left him isolated and exposed. When it was over, Vivian stood. Thank you for your confidence, she said to the board. I look forward to working with all of you to build a company that our employees can be proud of. She walked out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving Preston Whitfield to contemplate the ruins of his carefully constructed schemes. Theodore was waiting in her office when she returned. Well, he asked, his face tight with anxiety. Vivian crossed the room in 3 strides and kissed him hard and fierce and full of triumph. We won, she said when they finally broke apart. We won everything. She explained what had happened, the transition, the nomination, the revelation about Preston's corruption. Theodore listened with growing amazement, shaking his head in disbelief. You planned this, he said, all of it. I spent 72 hours planning it. Vivian smiled. It turns out that when you have something worth fighting for, you fight harder than you ever thought possible. Theodore pulled her close, holding her tight. What happens now? He asked. Now, Vivian rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Now we build something better. The employee welfare initiative, the flexible hours, the on-site childcare, all of it. Patricia will implement it, and I'll make sure the board doesn't interfere. And us, Vivian looked up at him, at this man who had changed everything. That depends, she said. Are you still interested in finding out together? Theodore smiled, and it was the smile she had first seen in a tiny kitchen, surrounded by colorful artwork and the smell of too much cinnamon. I was hoping you'd ask. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning that smelled like autumn leaves and new beginnings, Vivian Caldwell signed the final paperwork on a house, not a penthouse, not a mansion, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a maple tree in the backyard and a porch that wrapped around the front. The kitchen needed updating. The master bedroom was smaller than her old walk-in closet. The previous owners had painted the living room an unfortunate shade of yellow that would need to be addressed immediately. But it had good bones and better light. It had a yard where a 6-year-old could run and play. It had room for a family to grow. Theodore stood beside her as she signed, his hand warm on her back. Are you sure about this? He asked. It's a big change. Your apartment was empty. Vivian set down the pen. My apartment was empty, Theodore. Beautiful and expensive and completely empty. She looked around the living room, seeing not what it was, but what it would become. Emmeline's drawings on the walls, books piled on every surface. The kind of beautiful mess that came from a life fully lived. This is what I want, she said. This is what I've always wanted. I just didn't know it until you showed me. They moved in the following weekend with the help of friends from the office and the barely contained chaos of a 6-year-old who had very specific opinions about which room should be hers. This one, Emmeline announced, standing in the doorway of the smallest bedroom. Because it has the best window, and I can see the tree, and Daddy says trees are where fairies live. I said trees are where birds live, Theodore corrected gently. Same thing. Emmeline was already planning where her drawings would go, her voice carrying through the empty house like music. Vivian watched her and felt something she had never experienced before. Belonging. She had spent her whole life trying to prove that she was enough. Enough for her father's legacy. Enough for the board's approval. Enough for a world that constantly demanded more. But here in this imperfect house with its ugly yellow walls and two small bedrooms, she finally understood that she had been measuring the wrong things. She was enough, not because of what she had accomplished, but because of who she had chosen to love. That night, after the boxes were unpacked and Emmeline was tucked into her new bed, with her stuffed rabbit and a promise that the fairies in the tree would watch over her, Vivian sat on the porch with Theodore and watched the stars come out. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she admitted. "I keep expecting to wake up and discover that this was all a dream." "It's not a dream." Theodore reached over and took her hand. "It's just life. The good parts that we forget that are possible when we spend too long focusing on the bad." Vivian leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Anything." "I love you." The words came out easier than she had expected. Not a confession or a revelation, just a simple statement of truth. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands, the way he had the night she had first admitted she might want more. "I love you too," he said. "I think I have since you cried on my terrible couch and didn't apologize for ruining my shirt." Vivian laughed, remembering that night. The mascara tears, the wine-stained sobs, the complete and total collapse of everything she had thought she was. "I was a mess," she said. "You were human." Theodore kissed her forehead. "That's all. Just human." They sat together until the stars were thick overhead, until the autumn chill drove them inside, until the old house wrapped around them like a promise. This was home, not a place but a feeling, a choice made every day to stay, to try to love, even when it was hard. Vivian finally understood what Sarah had tried to teach Theodore all those years ago. Love was worth the risk. Always. The question came on a Sunday morning 6 weeks after they had moved in. Vivian was making breakfast, attempting the French toast recipe Emmeline had taught her. She had finally mastered the art of not burning it, though she still tended toward excessive cinnamon. Theodore was reading the paper at the kitchen table, a habit that made him seem older than his years, but that Vivian found endearing. The house smelled like coffee and vanilla and the particular warmth of a family beginning their day together. Emmeline appeared in the doorway, still in her unicorn pajamas, her hair a wild tangle of curls. "Miss Caldwell," she said, and her voice was different somehow. Smaller, more uncertain. Vivian turned from the stove. "Yes, sweetheart." Emmeline fidgeted with the hem of her pajama top, not meeting Vivian's eyes. Whatever she wanted to ask, it was clearly important. "You know how you live with us now," Emmeline said slowly. "And you help Daddy make dinner, and you read me stories, and you're here when I wake up." "Yes." "And you know how Daddy said that families are people who choose to love each other." Vivian felt her heart begin to race. "Yes, I remember." Emmeline finally looked up and her brown eyes were bright with a hope that was almost painful to witness. "Can I call you Mom?" The kitchen went silent. Theodore lowered his paper, his expression unreadable. The French toast sizzled on the stove, forgotten. Vivian knelt down, bringing herself to Emmeline's level. Her knees protested, her designer instincts cringed at the worn linoleum, but none of that mattered. "Emmeline," she said softly, "are you sure that's what you want? I've been thinking about it a lot." Emmeline's voice was solemn in the way only children can manage when discussing matters of great importance. "I know I had a mommy before, and I know she's watching me from the stars, but Daddy says she would want me to be happy, and having you makes me happy." She paused, gathering courage for the next part. "You're not my first mommy, but maybe you could be my next mommy, if you want to." Vivian felt the tears coming and did not try to stop them. Something unlocked inside her, and something that had been sealed away for 34 years. She had cried so much in the months since that first night, had rediscovered emotions she had buried for decades. But these tears were different. These tears were joy. "Oh, sweetheart." She pulled Emmeline into her arms, holding her close. "Of course you can call me Mom. You can call me anything you want." Emmeline hugged her back with the fierce strength of a 6-year-old who had finally gotten something she had been afraid to ask for. "Really, you mean it?" "I mean it." Vivian pulled back to look at her, at this precious child who had chosen her. I would be honored to be your mom. Emmeline's face split into the biggest smile Vivian had ever seen. Daddy, did you hear? She said yes. Theodore was suddenly there, wrapping his arms around both of them, creating a circle of warmth that felt like everything Vivian had never known she was missing. I heard, sweetheart, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I heard. They stayed like that for a long moment, the three of them tangled together in the kitchen of their imperfect house. The French toast slowly burning on the stove, the morning light streaming through windows that needed cleaning. It was messy and chaotic, and nothing like the life Vivian had planned. It was perfect. That night, after Emmeline was asleep and the house had settled into its quiet evening rhythms, Vivian stood in the doorway of the master bedroom and watched Theodore turn down the covers. It was such a simple act, such an ordinary part of life. The kind of thing that happened in millions of bedrooms across the country every night. But for Vivian, who had spent so many years in beds that were too big and too empty, it felt like a miracle. Theodore looked up and caught her watching. He smiled, and it was the same smile she had first seen in a cramped apartment kitchen when he had handed her terrible coffee and asked no questions she wasn't ready to answer. Coming to bed, he asked. Vivian smiled back, feeling the rightness of this moment settle into her bones. Can I ask you something first? Anything. She walked into the room, stopping at the edge of the bed they now shared. Is this bed big enough for two? The question hung in the air between them, an echo of that first impossible night when neither of them had known where this would lead. But the meaning was different now. Not a drunken confession or a startled admission. A deliberate choice made with full knowledge of everything it would cost and everything it would bring. Theodore reached for her hand, pulling her gently toward him. Only if you are the one beside me, he said. The same answer he had given all those months ago, but now it was a promise. Vivian lay down beside him, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. The bed was not as large as the one in her old penthouse. The sheets were not as expensive. The room was smaller, the mattress softer, everything about it imperfect. But it was exactly right. Because it was not the bed that mattered. It was who was in it. I'll always be the one beside you, she said into the darkness. For as long as you'll have me. Theodore pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead. Then you'll be there forever. They fell asleep tangled together the way they would fall asleep every night for the rest of their lives. Two people who had been broken in different ways, who had found in each other the courage to become whole again. Outside, the maple tree rustled in the autumn breeze. Inside, Emmeline slept soundly in her fairy tree view bedroom, dreaming of colors and families, and all the magic that comes from people choosing to love each other. And in the master bedroom, Vivian Caldwell, who had once been the loneliest woman in a city of 8 million people, finally understood what she had been searching for all along. Not power, not success, not the endless pursuit of being enough. Just this simple, messy, beautiful life. This man who saw her when she was invisible. This child who chose her to be a mother. This home filled with too much cinnamon and not enough matching furniture. She had built empires, but none of them compared to what she had built here. The bed was big enough. It had always been big enough. She just needed to find the right person to share it with. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the night that had changed everything, Vivian came home from work to find Emmeline waiting on the porch. The little girl was 7 now, all long legs and missing teeth and opinions about everything. She had started second grade with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. Mom, Emmeline launched herself at Vivian the moment she stepped out of the car. Your home, Dad's making dinner, and he says it's a surprise, but I know it's lasagna because I saw the noodles. Vivian laughed, scooping her daughter up into a hug. Is that so? What happened to keeping secrets? I'm very bad at secrets. Emmeline grinned, completely unrepentant. Dad says I get it from you. Does he now? They walked into the house together, Emmeline chattering about her day, about the art project she was working on, about the new friends she had made at school. The yellow walls were gone now, replaced by a warm cream color that Emmeline had helped choose. The kitchen had been updated, though they still burned French toast at least once a month. Emmeline's artwork still covered the walls, but now the drawings included more figures, friends and teachers, and the occasional superhero. The original family portrait was still in Theodore's bedside drawer, but new versions decorated the living room. Three people holding hands under a yellow sun with a house and a tree and stars that watched over everything. Theodore was in the kitchen wearing an apron that Emmeline had decorated with fabric markers. He looked up as they entered, his face lighting up the way it always did when he saw them. "There's my girls," he said. Vivian crossed the kitchen and kissed him, a brief brush of lips that still made her heart skip after all this time. "I hear there's lasagna." There was supposed to be a surprise. Theodore glared at Emmeline without heat. "Someone has a big mouth." "I have a regular mouth," Emmeline protested. "It's just very full of words." They sat down to dinner at a table that was slightly too small for three people, but that none of them would have traded for anything. The lasagna was good, not great. Theodore was still learning. The conversation was loud. Emmeline had inherited her mother's inability to stop talking once she got started. The kitchen was messy, the candles didn't match, the wine was from a bottle that had been on sale. It was perfect. After dinner, while Theodore did the dishes and Emmeline worked on her homework, Vivian slipped out to the porch to watch the stars come out. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, the untouchable CEO with the empty penthouse and the fortress walls, the woman who had believed that love was a weakness, that vulnerability was a trap, that the only way to survive was to need no one. That woman seemed like a stranger now. A ghost from a life Vivian had stopped living the night she let Theodore Mercer carry her up 3 flights of stairs to a cramped apartment in a worn couch. The door opened behind her and Theodore settled into the chair beside hers. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said. Vivian smiled. "I was thinking about that first night, when I asked you about your bed." "Ah," Theodore nodded knowingly. "That question. You could have said anything. Could have made a joke or changed the subject or pretended you didn't hear." "I could have. But you didn't. You gave me an honest answer, even though it was risky, even though it could have cost you your job." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to know why?" "Yes." He reached over and took her hand the same way he had 100 times before. "Because when you asked that question, I saw something in your eyes. Something that told me you weren't really asking about the bed. You were asking if there was room for you. In my life, in my family, in whatever came next." He squeezed her hand gently. "And the answer was yes. It was always yes. I just didn't know it until you asked." Vivian felt the familiar sting of tears and let them come. She had learned to stop fighting them, to let herself feel everything that came with loving people this much. "I'm glad I asked," she said. "I'm glad you did too." They sat together as the stars appeared one by one, as the sounds of Emmeline finishing her homework drifted through the open window, as the night wrapped around them like a promise kept. The bed was big enough. The house was full enough. The life they had built together was everything Vivian had never known she wanted. And when they finally went inside, when they tucked Emmeline in and read her the story she demanded and kissed her goodnight, when they retreated to their own room and lay down side by side in the bed they shared, Vivian asked the question one more time, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she loved hearing it. "Is this bed big enough for 2?" Theodore smiled in the darkness, pulling her close. "Only if you're the one beside me." And she always would be.